Imagine you're speaking with a loved one, and suddenly they freeze. Their eyes are fixed on you. They hear everything, understand everything, yet cannot move. They've become a living statue. Now, imagine this state lasting not minutes, but decades. In the 1920s, this happened to 5 million people. Today, we'll investigate. What was this force that could steal a person's body but leave their mind untouched? 5 million afflicted worldwide, from clinics in Vienna to factories in Manchester and the docks of New York. 1 million died in the first few months. The rest, locked in their own bodies, spectators of their own lives. This wasn't a localized outbreak. It was a silent pandemic that history nearly erased, overshadowed by the roar of the Spanish flu. But in its horror, it was no less devastating. The disease didn't just kill. It acted like a cold-blooded kidnapper with a twisted signature. Some it plunged into years of sleep. Others, conversely, deprived of sleep for weeks, leading to complete exhaustion. It had no clear pathogen visible under a microscope. Doctors were helpless. It defied all treatment. And strangest of all, it virtually vanished without a trace by 1927, leaving behind an army of living statues. We will explore 3 main theories of its origin, and one of them is directly linked to a pandemic we all recently experienced. It all began not with horror, but with banality. Fever, sore throat, weakness. Doctors diagnosed it as the flu. Patients expected to recover in a couple of days. No one suspected this was a prelude to lifelong imprisonment. This masquerade as a common cold made the disease even more terrifying. Then, the malfunction occurred. A person would sit down for dinner and freeze with a spoon halfway to their mouth. They could be moved like a mannequin. Given a new pose, they would maintain it for hours. But inside, their consciousness remained crystal clear. They heard doctors discussing their hopeless condition. They felt touches. They were trapped in a one-person theater where the stage was their own immobile body. Freeze. Right now. For 5 seconds. Now imagine you can no longer command your body to move. Ever. You hear the clock ticking, conversations in the next room, but your body is no longer yours. This isn't paralysis, it's total disobedience. But not everyone experienced it this way. In a third of patients, the disease manifested with the exact opposite effect, hyperactivity. Their bodies didn't freeze but entered a state of endless malfunction. Insomnia for weeks, uncontrolled tics and grimaces, obsessive repetitive movements, finger tapping, tongue clicking. This proved the virus wasn't attacking muscles, it targeted the conductor of the entire orchestra, the brain. And there was another, perhaps the strangest symptom. Without any warning, a patient's eyes would suddenly roll upwards and freeze in that position for minutes, sometimes hours. During these moments, their minds were flooded with obsessive, often frightening thoughts. It was an eerie window into how the disease broke not only movement, but the very structure of personality. Patients froze, doctors threw up their hands, panic gripped the world. But one man, Austrian neurologist Konstantin von Economo, noticed a tiny clue in the brains of deceased patients, inflammation in the same deep area. This clue gave the disease its official name, Encephalitis lethargica, and the first, albeit faint, hope of a solution. Von Economo pursued this lead. He autopsied skull after skull and saw what others had missed, a tiny but fierce inflammation deep in the brainstem, in the midbrain. This is your body's main switchboard, responsible for sleep, wakefulness, and basic movements. The virus didn't incinerate the entire brain, it delivered a precise, surgically accurate strike to the main switch. The most obvious theory? An unknown virus. A global hunt began. Scientists worldwide took cerebrospinal fluid samples, tissue sections, tried to infect monkeys and rabbits. The result was zero. The virus didn't manifest. It left behind scorched earth but remained invisible, a ghost in the nervous system. This was the first great mystery of encephalitis lethargica. But soon, medical detectives noticed a chilling coincidence. The peak of the sleeping sickness coincided precisely with the decline of the deadliest pandemic in history, the Spanish flu. The epidemic graphs looked like mirror images of each other. This gave rise to a new theory. Perhaps it wasn't a separate disease, but a rare and monstrous consequence of the flu, a post-viral syndrome that, weeks or months later, attacked the brains of those who survived. Newspaper headlines of the time screamed about this horror: zombie epidemic, the soul-stealing disease. Fear became as contagious as the illness itself. People were afraid to fall asleep. Parents looked at their children who had recovered from the flu with suspicion. This was no longer just a medical problem. It was a social catastrophe, slowly plunging society into paranoia. And then, by 1927, it simply stopped. As suddenly as it began, new cases almost ceased to be registered. If it was a separate virus, where did it vanish? If it was a flu complication, why did it stop when the flu hadn't disappeared? The disease left, leaving behind millions of living statues in hospital wards. The world quickly forgot about them. Decades passed. Patients grew old, never having moved. Their tragedy became a medical footnote in old textbooks. But in 1969, a young neurologist named Oliver Sacks decided it wasn't over. He applied a new experimental drug to these statues. What happened next went down in history as the Great Awakening. But this miracle came with its own very high price. It wasn't a hospital in the usual sense. It was a museum of frozen time. Dusty wheelchairs lined the walls, people frozen in the same poses for decades. To the world, they were hopeless, their stories finished. But Sacks looked into their eyes and saw not emptiness. He saw prisoners still looking out through bars. He was sure they were still in there, inside. At this time, a new drug appeared in medicine, L-dopa. It was given to Parkinson's patients and worked wonders. The drug restored dopamine levels in the brain, a kind of fuel for movement. Sacks put forward a daring hypothesis. What if encephalitis lethargica had simply burned up all the reserves of this fuel in his patients? What if he just tried to refill the tank? It was a gamble, based on a hunch. No one knew what would happen if an engine that had been silent for half a century was started. Leonard was first. For 30 years, he could only barely move his fingers to write on a special board. After the first dose of L-dopa, he stood up and walked. He began to speak. He eagerly read books that had been published in the decades he had spent as a statue. He became alive again. It was like a resurrection from the dead. Sacks' scientific report read like a miraculous parable. For medicine, it was a shock. Inspired by this success, Sacks gave the drug to the others. A mass awakening began. People who had been considered hopeless rose from their chairs. They cried. They danced. They met aged relatives whom they remembered as young. Hospital corridors, silent for decades, filled with laughter and conversations. It was one of the most incredible and humanistic stories in 20th century medicine. A tragedy lasting half a century seemed finally over. Let's pause. On a medical miracle scale, this is a 10 out of 10, a triumph of human genius over disease. But now, let's introduce another scale, long-term effect. And here, the needle begins to plummet rapidly. Because the miracle proved temporary, and its side effects were perhaps more terrifying than the disease itself. The brain, receiving a full tank of fuel after 40 years of inactivity, simply went haywire. Patients developed monstrous tics that contorted their bodies. Their minds were attacked by vivid hallucinations and bouts of uncontrollable aggression. They found themselves trapped between two nightmares: the prison of immobility and the chaos of uncontrolled movements. Their consciousness couldn't accept that the world had moved 40 years ahead, and all their loved ones had aged or died. Ultimately, the doses had to be reduced, and most patients slowly returned to their previous frozen state. But now they had something new: memory. The memory of a short, agonizing awakening. The miracle turned into an even greater tragedy, but it left behind the main question. What if this disease never left? And can it return on a mass scale? It never left. Not entirely. Every year, doctors worldwide record isolated, scattered cases of encephalitis with a chillingly familiar pattern: frozen bodies, rolled up eyes, consciousness trapped inside. This is irrefutable proof. The mechanism capable of stealing a person's body still exists in nature. It slumbers. It's simply waiting for its perfect trigger, its ideal combination of virus and a vulnerable organism. And today, we have a third main suspect in this case. Perhaps it wasn't an external invader. Perhaps it was an internal betrayal, our own bodyguard, the immune system. Modern theory suggests that after battling some common pathogen, such as the streptococcus that causes strep throat, the immune system can go haywire. Its soldier cells, trained to kill the enemy, suddenly lose their target and mistakenly begin to attack their own command center, cells deep within the brain. This is classic friendly fire, an autoimmune catastrophe triggered by a common infection. If this seems distant to you, recall the state after a severe flu, or that brain fog that affected millions after COVID-19. Apathy, inability to concentrate, a total lack of energy. This is a micro version of encephalitis lethargica. It's your nervous system taking a mild but noticeable hit from the aftermath of a viral war. Now, multiply that state by 1,000 and stretch it over 50 years. You'll get an accurate description of what happened in the 20s. This shows how fragile our conscious control over our own body truly is. It rests on the most delicate biochemical balance. And therein lies the main blood-chilling lesson of the sleeping sickness. The most terrifying waves of a pandemic might not come during it, but months or even years later, when newspaper headlines have changed and everyone has exhaled and returned to normal life. We are accustomed to measuring the damage from a virus by the number of dead at the peak of an outbreak. But encephalitis lethargica screams to us from the past. Watch for neurological consequences. Watch for silent epidemics of apathy, depression, and chronic fatigue. This isn't just a bad mood. It could be the echo of a past battle, still reverberating through your nervous system. So, at the end of this century-long investigation, we have 3 folders on the table. First, an elusive ghost virus that came from nowhere and vanished to nowhere. Second, a monstrous complication of the Spanish flu, its dark, delayed echo. And third, the most unsettling, a malfunction in our own immune system, ready to betray at any moment. We have the story of millions of frozen people, and the story of a miraculous but agonizing awakening that turned into an even greater tragedy. It's time to gather all the evidence and deliver a verdict in this case. The verdict is this. This story leaves us with 3 brutal but vitally important lessons. First, any virus, even one that causes a common cold, can be a trigger for a full-scale catastrophe in the brain. We tend to fear the acute phase of illness, fever, and cough, but the real enemy often comes later, in silence, when we already consider ourselves healthy. The second lesson, perhaps the most important, our consciousness can remain absolutely intact, even when the body turns into a stone prison. The mind does not die, it simply loses all tools for connecting with the world. This is both the main horror and the main miracle of this story. And the third lesson, there are no simple miracles in medicine. Behind every great awakening lies its own, often invisible and very high price. Oliver Sacks's story is not only a triumph of science, but also a harsh warning about the fragility of the awakened mind. So what was it? What is the final answer science provides after 100 years? The most honest and most frightening. We still don't know 100%. The killer who stole 5 million lives was never officially identified and condemned, but we have a dominant working hypothesis that most modern neurologists lean towards. It's not one cause, it's a combination of the second and third theories. An external enemy, most likely one of the influenza virus strains, became simply a trigger, a detonator. It initiated an internal betrayal, an autoimmune attack on the brain in those individuals who were genetically predisposed to it. Their own army of defense cells, having lost the enemy, began to burn their own cities. It wasn't one enemy, it was a perfect storm, a coincidence of a virus, a vulnerable immune system, and perhaps other environmental factors that we still don't understand. But this is just the dominant theory, not a final verdict. The case is not yet closed. And while scientists continue to search for answers in laboratories, we can ask ourselves, what do you believe was the root cause of this horror? A unique ghost virus that came and vanished without a trace, leaving only ruins? Or was it a cruel, anomalous reaction of the body itself to another, more well-known disease, the price of immune error? Write just one word in the comments: virus if you believe in the first theory, or reaction if you lean towards the second. Let's see which version wins our investigation.